Hello and welcome back to The Critique. Today we're looking at the architecture of calm, a piece arguing that as we mature, relationship success shifts from high intensity to sustainable safety. It uses anecdotes from men across the globe and some neuroscience. It's a really compelling mix, but the execution needs a little structural engineering. Let's get into it.
Yeah, I have to say, the premise just hooked me right away. The writer clearly knows their stuff. I mean, both the science and the human side. But even with that strong content, I found myself kind of checking how much was left about halfway through. And I couldn't quite put my finger on why the momentum was dragging.
That feeling, it almost always points to structure. Let's look at the section with the three men, Michael, James, and Liam. The current structure, it relies way too heavily on this geographic list format. You know, Michael from the US, James from England, and that just inadvertently flattens the narrative arc.
Flattens it? See, I actually thought that was the clearest part of the essay. It felt very organized to me. You get the American perspective, then you hop across the pond to the Englishman, then down to the Kiwi. It's logical. Why does that kill the momentum?
It is logical, sure, but it's predictable. The weakness here is that by presenting the anecdotes one after the other based on location, basically, and then Michael said this, and then James said that, the insights start to feel repetitive instead of cumulative.
Ah.
They're just stopping at bus stops rather than actually riding a train toward a destination.
I see what you mean. It's stop-and-go traffic. But if we break that up, don't we risk losing the whole sense of place? I actually enjoyed visualizing James in that pub in England. If we start messing with the order, doesn't it all just become a blur of quotes?
That is the risk, yeah, but only if you strip out the detail. You can keep the pub, you just change the container it's in. So the suggestion here is to reorganize this whole section by theme, or maybe a psychological concept, rather than by geography. In a persuasive essay, the idea is the protagonist, right? Not the location.
Okay, walk me through that. Because right now, James is he's inextricably linked to England in the text. How do you uncouple that without, losing him?
Okay, let's use a concrete example. Instead of introducing James from England as the next stop on the tour, you introduce the concept of adaptive decision-making first. That's the psychological meat the author is trying to serve. You'd start a paragraph talking about how the aging brain shifts away from friction. Then you bring in James. You use his quote about choosing doors that open easily to illustrate that specific concept.
So James becomes the evidence, not the headline.
Exactly. He transforms from just guy number 2 into proof of concept.
I like that. But what about Michael and Liam? They seem to be saying totally different things. Michael is talking about his literal nervous system, digestion, heart rate, and Liam is talking about sunsets and aesthetics. How do you group those by theme?
I actually think they're saying the exact same thing, just in different languages. And that's the opportunity the writer missed. You could combine Michael's biological point, that calm nervous system, with Liam's metaphorical one, the sunsets. You can use them to show the link between a physical sensation and our emotional regulation.
Oh, I see. So you're saying the sunset is just the visual representation of that calm nervous system?
Precisely. Right now, they're separated by 3 paragraphs and an entire ocean. The suggestion is to merge them. Imagine a paragraph that starts with the body Michael's need for biological safety and then pivots directly to the eyes, to Liam's preference for the sunset. You could write something like, this biological need for a regulated nervous system, which Michael highlighted, manifests outwardly as a shift in aesthetics, what Liam calls preferring the sunset over the firework.
That is so much tighter. It forces the reader to connect the dots.
And it builds an argument. It says, biology drives philosophy. That is a sophisticated point that just gets lost when you list them as Michael said and Liam said.
It creates a kind of compound interest effect on the insights. Okay, but speaking of building an argument, let's talk about the science part of the title. The writer leans pretty heavily on terms like neuroscience and clinical psychology.
They do, and that brings us to the second major friction point. The piece frequently cites these scientific fields, neuroscience, clinical psychology, health education, but it often just juxtaposes them against the anecdotes rather than fully integrating them.
I felt that. There's a pattern, isn't there? An anecdote happens, and then immediately after there's a sentence saying neuroscience agrees.
Right.
But isn't that a good thing? I mean, in this day and age, backing up your stories with hard facts adds credibility. It shows the writer didn't just make this stuff up. Why is that a weakness?
Credibility is good, but clunky validation is bad. The weakness is that phrases like neuroscience agrees or in clinical psychology, this is called, they feel tacked on. They're just there to validate the anecdotes after the fact.
Right.
It creates this tell, don't show dynamic. It feels like a teacher stepping in with a red pen to grade the anecdote as correct. It just breaks the immersion. You're reading a story, and then suddenly you're reading a textbook citation.
It does feel a bit like name dropping. I know neuroscience, and he says I'm right.
Exactly. The authority of the science is used like a blunt instrument. The suggestion is to blend the scientific explanation into the narrative voice, so it explains the mechanism behind the anecdote rather than just labeling it.
Mechanism over labeling. I like that. But how do you do that without getting too dense?
Okay, let's rewrite the Michael section. Currently it reads something like, Michael said, I need a calm nervous system. The room laughed, but neuroscience agrees. A regulated nervous system supports memory.
Yeah, that but neuroscience agrees is the speed bump.
It just stops the flow. So here's a concrete example of a revision. When Michael joked about needing a calm nervous system, he wasn't just being funny. He was prioritizing his biological baseline. That craving for safety is actually the body's way of protecting memory and digestion.
That is smooth. You didn't even use the word neuroscience.
You don't have to. You're describing the biology. The reader trusts that you know the science because you are explaining how it works.
It trusts the reader's intelligence.
Let's try it with James. The text currently says, in clinical psychology, this is called adaptive decision-making. It's a definition.
Sounds like a Wikipedia sidebar.
Exactly. So a proposed revision, James's refusal to engage with complication is a textbook example of adaptive decision-making, a strategy the brain uses to conserve energy for resilience rather than waste it on friction.
Textbook example. That little phrase does a lot of heavy lifting there. It bridges the story and the science in one breath.
And notice how the science now serves the story? It explains why James acts that way. It doesn't just stand next to him nodding its head.
It makes the piece feel less like a research paper and more like a deep observation. But I want to pivot a little to the emotional core of this piece. Because while the science is interesting, the argument is really about love and aging.
It is. It's about what we value as we get older.
And the writer takes a pretty strong stance on that. Calm is the goal. Fireworks are the past. But I have to play devil's advocate here for a second. Is there a risk that by framing it this way, we're alienating people who like the fireworks?
You've hit on the critical tonal issue. The argument inadvertently creates this false dichotomy where excitement or fireworks are framed as strictly immature, while calm or sunsets are the only mature goal.
It felt a little bit like being lectured by a very calm person. You know, oh, you still like butterflies in your stomach? How quaint. You'll grow out of it.
Exactly. And that defensive reaction you just had?
Yeah.
That's what the reader feels. The weakness is that by framing fireworks only as something to grow out of, the piece risks sounding dismissive of passion. It implies settling down means the death of intensity. It frames the younger perspective as just incorrect rather than just an early stage.
But isn't the writer's point valid? High drama is unsustainable. If the writer believes that, shouldn't they just say it?
They should say it, but they need to frame it as an evolution, not a rejection. The suggestion is to explicitly acknowledge the value of the fireworks stage. That makes the transition to sunsets feel like a gain, not a loss.
A gain. That's the key. Because right now, trading a firework for a sunset, it kind of feels like trading a sports car for a minivan. You know, safe, but boring.
Right. So let's look at a concrete example of how to fix that metaphor. We need to validate the butterflies. Instead of dismissing them, frame them as the starter motor. You need the starter motor to turn the engine over. That spark, that anxiety, that thrill, it's crucial for ignition.
But you can't drive across the country on the starter motor.
Exactly. The
The calm nervous system is the fuel that keeps the car running. If you frame it that way, you aren't saying the starter motor is stupid, you're just saying it has a very specific, limited function.
That's a great analogy. It respects the young phase.
And on the sunset metaphor, the writer needs to work a bit harder there. Explain that a sunset isn't less intense than a firework, it is just sustainably intense. A firework explodes and it leaves you in the dark. A sunset lingers. Frame it as a superior form of light, not a dimmer one.
Sustainably intense. That's a phrase the listener should probably write down. It changes the whole vibe from giving up to leveling up.
It makes the reader want to go there, rather than feeling like they are being forced to retire.
Now, speaking of retiring, we need to talk about how this piece ends, because I felt like it retired about 3 different times.
Ah, yes, the false endings.
I was reading it, and I got to this paragraph about a podcast comment, and I thought, okay, that's a wrapped bow. Then there was a final message, then an anecdote about smiling, then a line about a story resting. I felt like I was clapping at a concert, and the band just kept coming back out to tune their instruments.
It's a classic case of multiple ending syndrome. The piece suffers from this because that transition from the podcast comment to the final message, to so when someone smiles, and then finally to the end, it just dilutes the impact.
Why do we do this? Is it just insecurity, like we need to make sure we really said the thing we wanted to say?
Usually it's discovery writing. The writer is figuring out their conclusion as they type the final page. They write one ending, then think, no, that's not quite it. And they write another, and another. And because they are all pretty well-written paragraphs, they just keep them all.
But the effect on the reader is just exhaustion. The punch of the final line is gone because I've already mentally checked out.
Exactly. The weakness is the reader expects the piece to stop several times, so the tension just drops. The suggestion is ruthless. Consolidate the final 4 paragraphs into one tight, punchy conclusion.
Okay, let's get the scalpel out. What goes?
First, that paragraph about the podcast comment. Unless this essay started with that anecdote, which it didn't, bringing in a meta-commentary about I saw a comment on a podcast right at the climax is so distracting. It breaks the fourth wall for no reason.
Cut it, gone. What about the smile anecdote? Nope, too much trouble. I actually loved that line. It felt very human.
It is human, so keep the line but lose the paragraph break. Merge that anecdote directly into the final medical balance paragraph.
How do you stitch those together, though? One's a casual remark, the other is this heavy thematic summary.
You use the casual remark to prove the thematic summary. Here's a concrete example of a rewrite. When someone says, nope, too much trouble, it isn't laziness. It's the sound of a nervous system choosing health over exhaustion. That is the ultimate balance medicine strives for, between desire and discernment, proving that a good relationship shouldn't just excite you, it must support you.
Oh, wow. That hits hard.
See the difference? You get the grit of the quote, too much trouble, and then immediately pivot to the ultimate balance medicine strives for. It synthesizes the teaching tool and the medical aspect.
And it leaves you with that final thought. It shouldn't just excite you, it must support you. That's the bumper sticker. That's the takeaway.
And because you haven't fatigued the reader with 3 other almost endings, that line just lands with its full force.
You know, looking back at all these notes, the structure, the science, the tone, the ending, it feels like the common thread is trust.
How so?
Trusting the reader to understand the theme without a geographic map. Trusting them to get the science without a citation. Trusting the reader to value the starter motor without dismissing it. And trusting the final sentence to do the job without adding 3 postscripts.
That is a brilliant observation. Over-explaining and over-structuring are usually signs that the writer is afraid the point isn't landing. But the material here is strong. The writer just needs to clear away the scaffolding so we can see the building.
I'm really curious if they make these changes, specifically the structural one about the listicle. How much rewriting is that really? It sounds daunting.
It's actually more of a remix than a rewrite. The sentences about James and Michael are good. You're just cutting them out of the location folder and pasting them into the concept folder. It's moving furniture, not building a new house.
That's reassuring. And the payoff seems worth it. I imagine the read time will feel much, much faster.
Much faster. And the authority of the piece will skyrocket. It'll feel like a synthesized theory of life rather than just a collection of interesting observations.
Well, I'm sold. I want to read the V2 of this immediately.
So let's recap the action plan for our listener. We have 4 major moves to make. First, structure and flow. Reorganize that anecdote section by psychological concept, not by geography. Stop the bus tour and start the argument.
Second, integration. Stop name-dropping neuroscience. Rewrite those sentences to show the biological mechanism working inside the story. Make the science the narrator, not the footnote.
Third, tone. Validate the fireworks. Don't make the reader feel stupid for wanting passion. Frame the sunset as an upgrade in intensity, not a retirement plan. Use the starter motor analogy.
And finally, fix the endings. Combine the last 4 paragraphs. Cut the meta-fluff. Weld that smile quote to the medical balance conclusion and just exit on a high note.
This submission has the DNA of a viral essay. It tackles a universal problem, love and aging, with real expertise. It just needs to get out of its own way.
I completely agree. To the author, you have a gem here. Polish it up, trust your material, and send it back to us. We'd love to see how it lands.
Absolutely. Thank you for submitting, and thank you for listening. Go make those edits.
Can't wait to see it.
That's all for this critique. We'll see you next time.